Chapter 91. Licking his lips, Sunny cautiously said, "It's not as you think, Neff. We've been caught in a trap by the soul tree. It's not benevolent, it's not protecting us. In fact, it's doing the opposite. If we don't leave this island, we'll become its slaves forever. Or until it finds someone stronger and devours us." She tilted her head and looked at him with an unreadable expression. "Come on, Nephi's. Remember. We've talked about this already. This whole thing was your idea to begin with." For a moment, he thought that his words had awoken the stolen memories in her mind. But her response shattered those hopes into pieces. "Leave the great tree? You have really lost your mind. Curses." Changing Star raised her sword and said in a tone that made Sunny tremble, "Let Cassie go. Now." He hesitated, thinking about the best course of action. Then, he carefully placed the blind girl on the ground. "All right. I did. See? Now listen to me. I have something very important to tell you." Before he was done speaking, Nephi's disappeared from his view. Realizing that he was about to be attacked, Sunny prepared to defend himself. However, a moment later, he was already lying on the ground, the tip of the silver sword pressed against his throat. Changing Star was standing above him, pale lights burning in her eyes. Well, that was embarrassing. All his training, all the experience he had won in countless bloody battles, all the power he had gained. Sunny had really thought that he stood a decent chance of standing his ground in a fight against Nephi's, maybe even reaching a tie. But in the end, he had only lasted a second. One would be tempted to call this shameful display a premature capitulation. "Nice one, idiot. Now stop fooling around and focus." Feeling the cold steel touching his skin, Sunny tried to move as little as possible. He was pretty sure that Changing Star wouldn't just kill him in cold blood, but it was still better to not give her any reasons to do something drastic. After all, Neff's mind was not all there. Looking up at her cold, indifferent face, Sunny strained his vocal cords and shouted in exasperation, "Aster Song Vale!" Nephi's hand trembled, making a drop of blood roll down his neck. Her eyes opened wide, full of surprise and shock. Then, a dark expression appeared on her face. Pressing slightly on the sword, she took a step forward and pierced him with a burning gaze. When she spoke, her voice was trembling with suppressed emotions. How do you know these names? Who are you?" Sunny blinked, equally as surprised by her reaction. He had thought that these weird words were just a part of some code to jog her memory awake. But as it turned out, they were not. "Aster Song Vale, what the hell does it mean? What can make Nephi's lose her cool? It has to be something important." Trying to stay as still as possible, he cautiously glanced at the blade of the sword and honestly answered, "I didn't even know that these were names. It's just what you told me to tell you in case you forget what had to be done. You said if I tell you this, you'll listen to me." Nephi stared at him, a shadow of doubt appearing on her face for a split second. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by grim determination. Gritting her teeth, she snarled, "Which domain do you belong to?" Sunny had no clue what she wanted him to say. So he just asked, "What's a domain?" She grinned, a maniacal glimmer appearing in her eyes. This was very unlike calm, composed Nephi's. If Sunny didn't know better, he would think that a completely different person was standing in front of him. A person that was much more unpredictable and dangerous. Meanwhile, Neff said, "Don't pretend to. Suddenly she stumbled, then frowned. It seemed as though Sunny's question touched something in Changing Star's mind, causing a chain reaction. A few seconds passed, each turning her frown deeper. Slowly, the familiar poised calmness returned to her eyes. It didn't seem as though she had remembered everything, but, just as Nephi's had promised, it seemed enough to make her listen to what Sunny had to say. He understood it from the fact that she had finally removed the tip of the sword from his throat. She even helped him stand up. Looking at Sunny with a strange expression, she then said, "I really told you those words?" Rubbing his slightly cut neck, he simply nodded. Bloodweave was already busy repairing the damage to his skin. Nephi's looked down, then closed her eyes for a few moments. When she opened them again, they were full of resolve. What do I need to do? Sunny really wanted to ask her about the meaning of the 3 mysterious names, but decided against it. They had to hurry. Ask Cassie to summon her staff. Then get her into the boat. Dismissing her sword, Changing Star glanced at him for the last time and walked toward her friend. Somehow, Nephi's had managed to talk Cassie into following her and boarding the ghastly vessel. She probably had to lie about a lot of things, but Sunny didn't want to ask, afraid that his flaw would ruin everything. Once the girls were inside the boat, he wrapped his tired body into the shadow and put his hands on the metal hull. Every part of his body seemed to hurt in its own unique way. His mind was utterly exhausted. Come on, Sunny. One last push. With a crooked smile, he strained his muscles and pushed the boat toward black water. As the last light of dusk disappeared, submerging the world into absolute darkness, the boat built from the bones of a demon slipped from the ashen sand into the cold embrace of the dark sea. Following Sunny's instructions, Cassie aimed her staff and activated its enchantment, causing a strong gale to fill their modest sail. At first, the boat moved slowly, the mast creaking under pressure. But Changing Star's craftsmanship was meticulous and reliable. The demon's spine held, and little by little, the small vessel began to gain speed. Sunny sat at the stern, controlling the steering oar. In front of them, an endless expanse of black water stretched to the horizon, hiding indescribable horrors in its depths. Behind them, the terrifying soul-devouring tree was slowly growing smaller. Sunny stared at it, feeling a deep sense of regret grip his heart. He wished that he was powerful enough to destroy it. Leaving just like that, without exacting revenge on the ancient monster, filled him with anger. Well, at least he left it a present. Back at the ashen barrow, a candle was burning in a small alcove of stones that protected its flame from wind. Near the candle, a tall pile of dry, fallen leaves was towering over the alcove. It had taken Sunny a long time to gather that pile. He had scoured most of the island, hoping to make it as tall as possible. He had also mixed dry seaweed and the remaining fat of the carapace demon into the leaves. Some time later, the small candle was nearing the end of its life. Most of the wax had already melted, turning it even smaller. Just as the flame was about to go out, it ignited the leaves. After a few seconds, a massive, searing bonfire ignited in the middle of the island, illuminating the scarlet leaves of the evil tree. Almost instantly, the black water surrounding the island surged with movement. Sunny was already too far away to see any of it. He didn't know if the creatures of the dark sea would be able to obliterate the soul devourer. He strongly doubted that the ancient fiend was that easy to destroy. However, with the carapace demon dead and the 3 humans meant to replace him gone, there was no one on the island to protect the gluttonous tree. Perhaps it would be seriously harmed, at least. For now, it was the best he could do. Looking back in the direction of the ashen barrow, Sunny gritted his teeth and thought, one day, I will become powerful enough to destroy that tree, these monsters, and anyone else who would dare to stand in my way. One day, I will become powerful enough to never be afraid again, of anyone or anything. Instead, all of them will fear me. He didn't notice that, just as he was thinking these words, Cassie suddenly raised her head and turned in his direction. On her face, a dark expression appeared, soon erased by uncertainty and doubt. Chapter 92. In the absolute darkness, a small vessel was gliding on the black surface of a restless sea. Its mast, made of a demon's spine, was straining under the assault of the winds. In the eerie silence of this vast and lightless void, the swift boat cut through the waves like a blade. No sounds could be heard except for the creaking of bones and the crashing of water against its polished metal hull. Sunny sat at the oar, steering the carapace vessel. He was guiding them west. With no moon or stars to show them the path, it was hard to keep the boat on course. But there was a mark left in his mind by the cold and menacing shadow of the crimson spire. Using it as a compass, he was able to navigate the treacherous waters without losing his way. Black skies above, dark sea beneath. With nothing but a thin layer of steel separating them from the tenebrous abyss, they sailed through the night. Below them, countless horrors were hiding in the cursed depths. Several times, Sunny felt gargantuan shadows moving close to the small boat, attracted by the sound of its passing. Powerless to do anything, he had no choice but to tremble in silence, praying that the terrible creatures would turn away. So far, luck was on their side. Perhaps they were too small and feeble to satiate the hunger of these ancient leviathans. A few hours after the start of the voyage, Sunny felt that the constant pull on his mind had begun to wane. His thoughts were slowly becoming clearer, the haze of forgetfulness weakening with each minute. Soon, a ghostly sound of shattering glass resounded in his head. Instantly, the last remnants of the fog that was clouding his consciousness disappeared. He was free from the enthrallment of the soul devourer. Relieved, Sunny couldn't help but smile. However, his smile was weak and hesitant. With the effects of the mind hex gone, his usual sharpness had returned. It felt as though an invisible weight had been lifted, allowing his thoughts to finally flow unobstructed once again. Everything became clearer, as though the whole world suddenly came into focus. It was a wonderful feeling. But with it came a better understanding of how terrifying and precarious their current situation was. They were quite literally balancing on the edge of a hungry abyss, their lives relying on nothing but capricious fortune. The decision to venture into the dark expanse of the cursed sea on a makeshift boat was pure insanity. But then again, there was nothing sane about the forgotten shore to begin with. In this desolate hell, the craziest choice was sometimes the best one you had. Gritting his teeth, Sunny held the oar and stared into the darkness. A few minutes later, Cassie suddenly shifted, making the boat gently sway. She handed the magical staff to Nephi's and cautiously moved closer to Sunny, feeling her way through the darkness with her hands. Before Sunny could guess what was it that she wanted from him, he was suddenly caught in a tight embrace. The blind girl hid her face in his chest, hot tears streaming down her face. Sunny froze, stunned and having no idea what to do. He could feel Cassie's body pressed against him and shaking from crying, her hands tightly wrapped around his neck. While he was trying to comprehend the situation, she quietly whispered, "Thank you, thank you." Feeling extremely awkward, Sunny pretended to clear his throat. No need to thank me. If it wasn't for your warning, we would still be stuck on that island. So we're even." Then, he raised his hand and awkwardly patted her on the back. Both of them were careful to keep their voices as quiet as possible, afraid that they will attract something from the black depths. Cassie silently cried for several minutes, then finally let go of him. Wiping her face, she pulled her body away and whispered, "I'm sorry." Her voice sounded a bit strange. Confused, Sunny raised his eyebrows. "What is she apologizing for?" I'm sorry too. For, grabbing you back then." She smiled and, wiping the last tear from her face, turned away to move back to the middle of the boat. Sunny was left alone once again. With nothing to do except for holding the steering oar, he let his thoughts wander. With his mind clear again, many things were worth revisiting. He had to distract himself from the eerie pressure of the endless dark emptiness somehow, anyway. Despite the fact that their experience with the soul devourer was nothing short of harrowing, Sunny had somehow managed to end up considerably better off on the other end of it. His haul this time was truly unbelievable. He had received an amazing new weapon, no less than 100 shadow fragments, and 2 new attributes. Spark of Divinity was a real improvement over its previous version. The ability to perceive the inner structure of memories alone opened a whole new horizon of possibilities. However, he was more interested in the mysterious bloodweave. Somehow, Sunny felt that he had severely underestimated the uniqueness and importance of that attribute. Its origins, too, were covered in a veil of secrets. Who was that weaver whose ichor he had consumed? Who were the unknown that even the spell was reluctant to mention? What was their connection to the gods? Why were the type and rank of the initial memory he had received from the vile thieving bird's spawn left empty? How was it even possible for a memory to give and awaken new attributes? That last question guided him to think of something else. Glancing up, he stared at Nephi's and tried to recollect their conversation. Looking back, she had revealed a lot of things that he had failed to notice in the moment. First of all, Sunny now knew that Cassie's enchanted armor, which had been given to her by Changing Star, was an awakened memory of the sixth tier. That meant that it came from an awakened terror, a nightmare creature one class above Mountain King that he himself had killed in his first nightmare. The secret of how Changing Star had managed to earn her true name was now one step closer to being revealed. Chapter 93. Apparently, as far as accomplishing the impossible went, Nephi's had outdone even Sunny. An aspirant triumphing over an awakened tyrant was already unbelievable enough. But killing an awakened terror gave the word unbelievable a whole new meaning. No wonder her aspect ability is so versatile. Now, he was almost sure that Changing Star's aspect was of the divine rank, just like his. That would explain why she was able to both heal and destroy with her strange and formidable powers, a combination as rare as his own shadow control. What's the probability of two sleepers with divine aspects ending up so close to each other in the dream realm? Close to zero. It seemed like the unpredictable, fated, attribute had twisted the strings of fate once again. Sunny felt shivers running down his spine. His innate attribute was capable of bringing both terrible curses and incredible blessings. At first glance, their meeting with Nephi seemed like the latter. But if it was truly the result of fated, manipulating destiny, it could turn out to be the worst of calamities in the end. After all, one of the possible meanings of her true name was Star of Ruin. The fear he had felt in that short moment before crossing swords with Nephi's was still fresh in Sunny's mind. And there were other things that she had revealed too. She apparently knew something about the drop of ichor, being that she had called it a lineage memory, without batting an eye. That suggested that Nephi's knew much more about the spell than Sunny and the rest of the public did. It seemed as though there were secrets in the upper echelons of Awaken that they didn't want anyone else to know. The three mysterious names she had told him might have been another of these secrets. And that last word she used, asking which domain he belonged to. What were these domains? So many questions. Sunny spent many hours pondering them, as well as going over all the information about the forgotten shore he had gathered. The carapace boat flew over the dark water, drawing closer and closer to the western horizon. Soon, he felt that the night was already drawing its last breaths. The light of hope ignited in Sunny's heart. However, this was when their luck had finally run out. The disaster came unexpected, violently throwing them into a void of confusion. This time, Sunny had not felt anything approaching the boat. The danger simply appeared out of nowhere, leaving him no time to react. 1 second, the black waters were calm and clear. The next, they were boiling with movement, grotesque tentacles rising from them and wrapping themselves around the hull of the boat. Sunny tried to jump to his feet, but at that moment, the whole vessel was violently jerked to the side. Falling, he heard the moans of metal being bent and torn apart. Then, salty water filled his mouth. Rising, he caught a glimpse of Nephi standing at the bow of the boat, her silver sword lashing out at the approaching tentacle. However, blinded by darkness, she failed to notice a different threat. Another tentacle twisted and coiled around her body. Then, without even a scream, she was gone, dragged into the dark depths, with no hope to return. All that remained was a long blade stuck helplessly in the bulbous flesh of the massive tentacle. Sunny's eyes widened in disbelief. No, no, no. This can't be happening. The hull of the carapace vessel was then crushed and torn into pieces, throwing him into the cold, black water. For a moment, Sunny was stunned by the coldness. Then, wrapping the shadow around his body, he swam up, trying to reach the surface. Soon, he succeeded and spun, trying to see something, anything, to give him hope. But there was nothing around, only undulating waves and twisting tentacles. Except for, far in the distance, Sunny noticed an unclear shape rising above the water. He strained his eyes, trying to discern its nature. Then, his heart skipped a beat. A few 100 meters away, a giant stone hand towered above the surface of the sea, its palm opened as though trying to embrace the sky. It was slender and delicate, carved by the unknown sculptor with almost inhuman skill. If Sonny didn't know better, he would have thought that the hand belonged to a living, breathing being. But all of this didn't matter right now. All that mattered was that he had a chance to survive. Straining every muscle in his body, Sonny dodged a twisting tentacle and swam toward the hand, moving as fast as he could. But then, he suddenly stopped. And looked back. Misshapen pieces of metal and bone, all that remained of their boat, were floating on the surface of the dark sea. He had seen Neff being pulled under the water by the tentacles of the unknown creature, but Cassie, clad in her enchanted attention-repelling tunic, had a chance to escape. He couldn't just leave without at least trying to find her. Or can I? A dark thought appeared in Sonny's mind. After all, his own survival was the only thing that really mattered. Everything else was just a distraction. Why don't you think about yourself for a second? Are you really going to risk your precious life on the off chance that this helpless girl is still alive? He hesitated. Admit it, she is nothing but a burden. You always knew that one day she was going to drag you down. Yes, he did. But what? You're going to die, fool. Turn around and flee, now. Why was he even hesitating? This was his chance to escape. His only chance, perhaps. He had to survive. Feeling an almost unbearable feeling of regret filling his chest, Sonny slowly inhaled. Then, he gritted his teeth and dove down, heading back to the spot where their boat had been destroyed. What are you doing? Have you lost your mind? He couldn't see in the black water, but his shadow sense was still somewhat effective. He had a chance to feel Cassie's presence, at least if she wasn't already dead and dragged to the bottom of this cursed abyss. You fool! How is she worth it? Why are you doing this? Grimacing, he forced his annoying inner voice to shut up. In his mind, the answer was clear. Because I want to. Chapter 94. Because he wanted to. For once, Sonny's heart wasn't full of fear and despair. Instead, it was filled with defiant indignation. He was tired of bending under the pressure of the world, furtively clutching to the tiniest glimmers of hope, always afraid, always willing to do anything, abandon anything, just to survive for another day. It wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to make the world bend to his wishes instead. He wanted to live like a human being instead of an animal. In these past months, Sonny had changed without even noticing. Somehow, he had grown unsatisfied with his previous way of life, one where his sole goal of survival at all cost overshadowed everything else. Whether he lives or dies had always been the only thing that mattered. But now, how he lived mattered more. What was the point of having no master if he lived like a slave? Gritting his teeth, Sonny dove into the dark abyss. The cold water embraced him like a burial shroud. He couldn't see in this cursed blackness, relying only on his shadow sense for guidance. Salt sipped into the bite marks on his hands and the cut on his neck, making them burn. Not paying the agony any attention, Sonny used his considerable strength to propel himself deeper and deeper into the darkness. He could feel the giant tentacles moving in the water around him, pulling the pieces of the carapace boat into the gargantuan maw that was hiding somewhere far below. Once or twice, he had to desperately twist his body to avoid being touched by one of them. But still, no sign of Cassie. His lungs were starting to burn. Sonny dove deeper. At this depth, the water pressure was starting to affect his movements, making each stroke feel heavier. Even with his body enhanced by the shadow, there was a limit to how much it could withstand. Sonny suspected that without the blood weave, he would have suffocated a long time ago. What's worse, he felt as though he was getting closer and closer to the actual body of the unknown horror that had destroyed their vessel. He still couldn't sense its massive shape, but judging by the girth of the tentacles that surrounded him, the monster couldn't have been far. And then, Sonny finally noticed something. A short distance away from him, a small shadow was struggling against a much larger and ferocious one. Cassie! Gathering all his strength, Sonny swam toward the blind girl with as much speed as he could muster. As he drew near, he could discern the details of what was happening. Cassie was being pulled down, a smaller tentacle coiled around her body. She was still struggling, trying to get free, but her movements were growing weaker with each second. She was suffocating. Filled with fury, Sunny propelled himself forward and grabbed onto the tentacle, feeling slippery flesh throbbing in his grip. If he had any choice, he would have avoided touching that thing at all costs. But fighting underwater was tricky. If he wanted to deliver any sort of a powerful blow, he had to find some form of support first. Summoning the midnight shard, Sunny strained every muscle in his body and slashed across the tentacle, right below the point where it was coiled around Cassie's lower torso. He knew that he wouldn't be able to do any serious harm with that strike, which was slowed down to a crawl by the burdensome resistance of the black water. However, his amazing sword was still sharp enough to cut into the fleshy tentacle, causing a cloud of dark blood to gush out of the wound. The tentacle furiously twitched and shot sideways, as though trying to shake the attacker off. Flying through the darkness, Sunny held on for dear life and moved his blade upward, slicing the spongy flesh apart. He never hoped to chop the tentacle off with one strike. No amount of strength would have allowed that to happen. Luckily, swords were able to pierce, slash, and cut. Pushing the blade, Sunny cut deep into the tentacle. When the Tsuba was about to touch the wound, he changed his grip and pulled the Tachi down. Monster's flesh spread apart under the razor-sharp blade, barely offering any resistance. A torrent of blood surged out, and with the last push, the tentacle was completely severed. Sunny was finally able to turn his attention to Cassie to see how she was doing. What he sensed made him scowl. The blind girl was barely conscious. He needed to get her to the surface as fast as possible. Pushing away the twitching remains of the tentacle, Sunny dismissed his sword and grabbed Cassie across the torso, feeling how cold her skin was through the thin fabric of her tunic. Weakly, she tried to resist, not realizing that it was him and not the monster. Pressing the blind girl to his chest, Sunny turned his head up and felt a wave of desperation crashing against the walls of his mind. His lungs were in agony, no air whatsoever left in them. His body was slowly losing its strength, full of terrible pain and thirsting for a breath of fresh air with maddening intensity. Even if he could see anything, at this point, his vision would have begun to darken. And they were so far away from the surface. What's worse, the horror of the depths was now alerted to his location. Countless tentacles were already moving, surrounding them in an impenetrable barrier of flesh. A second or two later, they would be crushed to death in the devastating embrace of the sea monster. Sunny didn't know how to save them. But he wasn't going to give up, no matter what. Making an arduous stroke with his one free hand, he held tightly onto Cassie and swam up. The tentacles were approaching, blocking all paths of escape. Sunny gritted his teeth and, in the next moment, the water around them suddenly turned pure white. An incandescent radiance filled the vast expanse of the cursed sea, obliterating any sign of darkness. The explosion of light was so intense that it pierced through Sunny's eyelids and hurt his eyes. It was as though a miniature sun had ignited somewhere far below them, turning the endless black abyss into a pristine white void. Tidal currents of radiant water surged tumultuously, throwing the world into disarray. The gargantuan tentacles convulsed and writhed madly, as though in the throes of unbearable pain. The unbreakable barrier of flesh fell apart. Sunny wasn't about to let this chance go. Straining his suffocating body, he swam to the surface, dodging the writhing tentacles. With the furious white sun burning in the depths below, he could see their shapes clearly. Moving faster and faster, he propelled himself up with everything he had left. Sunny knew that surfacing that fast was dangerous, but there was no other choice. Both Cassie and himself did not have a lot of life left in them. They needed air. Although it seemed like an eternity, the white radiance began to dim just a few moments later. But it didn't matter. Sunny was already past the barrier of tentacles, swimming up with desperate speed. He was afraid that they wouldn't make it. His consciousness was already beginning to wane, slowly slipping into the cold clutches of empty nothingness. Even knowing that there was nothing but water around, he was still overwhelmed by the suicidal desire to open his mouth and inhale as deeply as he could. His muscles were spasming, devoid of oxygen for too long. And then, finally, Sunny's head broke the surface. Blinded by pain, he drew in a gasping breath and coughed uncontrollably. Held tightly in his arms, Cassie was doing the same. Her chest was ruggedly moving up and down, sucking in the sweet ambrosia of air. Sunny never knew how precious it was before, not even while being slowly poisoned by the harmful, polluted air of the outskirts. They made it. Trying to compose himself, Sunny looked around. The last remnants of the white radiance were long gone, erased as if they had never existed. The world was once again consumed by absolute darkness. However, far away in the east, the first light of dawn was about to shine from beyond the horizon. Catching the glimpse of the giant stone hand, Sunny gripped Cassie's shoulders and swam in that direction. Chapter 95. Sunny felt that he was at the end of his rope. He had put himself through too much abuse during these last few days. Now, it was hard to even remember when was the last time he had slept. A day before climbing the soul-devouring tree in search of a special fruit, perhaps. Since then, he had lived through the harrowing torture of the blood-weave transformation, spent countless hours on the verge of mental collapse to resist the effects of the enthrallment, mangled his hands to stay lucid, guided the boat through the terrors of the dark sea in absolute darkness, saw it being destroyed by the horrid dweller of the deep, and gave battle to that monster in the cold black depths, almost drowning as the result. His body and mind were on the brink of shutting off. Despite that, Sunny stubbornly continued to swim, bringing himself and Cassie closer and closer to the giant stone hand that was rising from the water, as though trying to embrace the skies. The dark sea was surging around him, still reeling from the effects of the light explosion that had rocked it some time earlier. Tall waves were threatening to drown the two sleepers, throwing them around like toys. Struggling against them was a hard task. And still, he persisted. The dawn was drawing close, but for now, there was still nothing but cold, darkness, and danger all around them. Any second, something could rise from the depths of the abyss and put an end to their desperate attempt to save themselves. At least the tentacles were gone, perhaps scared away by the pain of being exposed to the searing light. By some miracle, Sunny eventually managed to reach the stone hand. Hoisting Cassie up, he helped her climb on the dark rocks and followed closely behind. Soon, they reached the open palm of the hand and crawled to its center, then fell down, utterly spent and exhausted. For a long time, neither of them was able to talk. All Sunny could do was lay motionless, draw in raspy breaths, and try to stay awake. His mind was empty of thoughts. That was fine, because he didn't want to think. If he did, he would be forced to remember what had happened to. Shut up. What was the point of remembering? He couldn't change anything. The sound of the black water crashing against the base of the giant hand reminded him that the night was still not over. Opening his eyes, Sunny tried to understand their current circumstances. Their shelter was slightly raised above the waves, the base of the giant thumb almost touching the surface of the dark sea. The palm was not very spacious, roughly half the size of the circular platform that had saved his life on his first day on the forgotten shore. It was angled upward, creating a slight slope. The fingers were higher above waves and wide enough to accommodate a person, but they were bent upward toward the sky, making them less suitable to serve as a refuge. We need to get further away from the water. With that thought, Sunny tiredly stood up and bent down to touch Cassie's shoulder. Cassie! Stand up! We have to move higher! His voice sounded hollow and brittle. The blind girl flinched and raised her head, her skin deathly pale. Sunny? He nodded. Yeah. It's me. She was still in shock. Sunny could see that Cassie's mind was not all there yet, so he gently pulled her to her feet. Come on, let's go. It's just a few meters. She lingered. What happened? I heard a sound, and then something was pulling me down. He gritted his teeth and tried to keep his tone even. We were attacked by a sea monster. The boat was destroyed. I dove down and managed to find you, then swam to this pile of stones. It's not very high above the water, so... Cassie wavered. Where's... Sunny hurried to interrupt her, unwilling to answer the next question. Come, follow me. We can rest when we're higher. Gently guiding the blind girl, Sunny climbed to the base of the giant hand's index finger, which was the highest point they could reach without climbing the fingers themselves. Sitting down on the cold stone, he rested his back against the giant phalanx and stared at the restless surface of the dark sea. His eyes were cold and empty. Cassie was silent by his side. Her pale face was contorted, as though she simultaneously wanted to ask the question and dreaded the answer. Finally, gathering her courage, the blind girl whispered, her trembling voice barely audible. "Sonny! Where is Neff?" He stayed silent, not willing to speak the words out loud. Stupidly, he felt that if he spoke them, they would become the truth. But if he didn't, there was still a possibility that they were a lie. "I'm not answering." A few moments later, the familiar pressure appeared in his mind. The pressure grew and grew, making his head spin. "I'm not." Then, the piercing pain came. Sonny stubbornly endured it. He lasted for much longer than he had ever done before, keeping his mouth shut until hot tears rolled from his eyes, his whole body shaking from the terrible suffering. But eventually, he was still forced to say those bitter words. She's G. Before he could finish, a subtle sound attracted his attention. It came from below, from the edges of the restless dark waves. Sonny's heart skipped a beat. Out there at the base of the giant thumb, where the cursed sea was almost touching its stone surface, a pale white hand appeared from the black water and grabbed onto the rocks. Then, a tall figure slowly pulled itself onto the open palm of the stone giantess. His eyes widened. Feeling that something was wrong, Cassie turned her head and asked, "Sonny? What is it?" He trembled and whispered, gripped with sorrow. "It's Nephi's." An uncertain smile appeared on the blind girl's face. "Neff? She is all right?" Sonny found himself unable to answer. No, Nephi's was not all right. In fact, he didn't know how she was even alive. The Starlight Legion armor was shattered and torn, revealing the mutilated flesh beneath. There was a horrifying gaping wound on Changing Star's torso, looking as though almost half of her right side was missing. Sonny could see the sharp shards of broken ribs, the rivers of blood streaming down her legs, and the mangled mess of viscera spilling over the edges of the wound. He wanted to close his eyes. Another large chunk of flesh was missing from her thigh, exposing the shredded remnants of muscle and the white surface of the femur, cracked and barely holding together. Her right arm was severely damaged, too. In fact, it was almost torn off, hanging only by a narrow strip of skin and a few tendons, like that of a mistreated, broken marionette. Even her face was not spared. One of Neff's eyes was gone, its socket crushed and shattered. The skin of her cheek was shaved off as though by sandpaper, leaving behind a mangled mess of bleeding flesh and broken teeth. The sight of her was harrowing and heartbreaking. It was apparent that Changing Star was about to die. "Sonny? Why are you not answering?" He glanced at Cassie and bit his lip, trying once again to suppress the answer that was fighting its way out. Something sharp and hot was stabbing at his heart, making his vision blurry. Meanwhile, Nephi staggered and blindly stepped forward. Her legs buckled, and she heavily fell to her knees, splattering blood all over the cold surface of the stone. A terrible moan escaped from her lips as her cracked femur finally shattered, bone piercing through muscle and skin. Sonny felt as though he was thrown into his worst nightmare. He wanted to scream, but his voice was gone. A deep, almost physical pain was tearing him from inside. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to see this. And yet, he couldn't look away. That's why he noticed instantly when two white flames ignited in Neff's eyes. The radiance grew brighter and brighter, spilling from her eyes, her mouth, the gaping wounds in her body. It was as though there was a flaming star burning in the place where her heart should have been, as though she was nothing but white flame hidden behind a thin layer of human skin. The incandescent radiance filled Changing Star's blood, turning it into streams of liquid white fire. As Sonny watched, frozen in place with his eyes open wide, that fire began to melt and reshape her flesh. Slowly, her muscles repaired herself, her organs returned to their places, her bones reassembled themselves from the shards. Where there was nothing to replace a missing part, the fire took its shape and solidified. With a terrible scream, Nephi's grasped her almost severed arm and tore it away, then pressed it to the stump that was bleeding with white flame. Soon, the mangled halves melted together, becoming whole again. Shocked, he saw every terrible wound on her body heal, washed in the purifying fire. Soon, there was nothing but pristine white skin showing through the wide gaps in the shattered armor. Nephi's raised her head, looking at them but not seeing anything. There was no recognition in her gaze, all understanding destroyed by the cruel crucible of the sacred fire. Then the last daughter of the immortal flame clan closed her eyes and fell to the ground, losing consciousness. Finally, the first rays of sunshine appeared from beyond the eastern horizon. The dawn was coming. In the end, Nephi's had remained unconscious for an entire 2 days. On the third day, she finally opened her eyes and slowly rose, looking around with subtle confusion. Her face, as usual, was calm and indifferent. However, she did flinch a little when her gaze fell on Sunny, who was sitting at the top of the giant hand's index finger and grinning from ear to ear at her. Frowning, Changing Star looked herself over, noticing the embarrassing gaps in her armor, and said, "Why are you smiling?" Sunny gave her a mischievous wink and shrugged. "Look behind you." Lingering for a few seconds, Neff sighed and turned around, wondering what is it that he wanted her to see. Behind her, a dark expanse of land was rising above the slope of the colossal crater. And on it, a tall city wall built of gray polished stone was towering over the giant chasm of the abyss. It looked ancient but still impenetrable, able to withstand the crushing pressure of the dark sea for 1,000 more years. They've made it. That had found the human castle. End of Volume 1, Child of Shadows. Chapter 96. Wake up, Sunless! Your nightmare is... Shut the hell up! Trying to remain in the blissful embrace of sleep, Sunny hissed through his teeth and stubbornly closed his eyes tighter. He was warm and comfortable under the blanket, on his own bed, where all the problems of the world seemed less serious and dire. For a moment, there was silence. That's better. Wake up, Sunless! You're... God damn it! Thrusting one arm from under the blanket, Sunny summoned one of his memories. Immediately, a triangular leaf-shaped throwing dagger appeared in his hand, only to be thrown blindly at the source of the irritating voice. Missing its mark, the kunai clinked against the stone wall and fell to the floor. However, the voice did fall silent. Sunny sighed. It was already too late. He was awake. Far in the distance, the waves were starting to crash against the city wall. The night was coming, so it was time to get up. Opening his eyes, Sunny sat up and looked around. His room was beautiful and spacious. The stone walls were engraved with intricate patterns, creating an atmosphere of sanctity and elegance. The furniture was made out of pale polished wood, with several mismatched pieces that Sunny had scavenged from different places himself. The room had no windows, however. There were light wells cunningly hidden here and there. Sadly, the ingenious system of mirrors that was supposed to bathe the hidden chamber in sunlight was long destroyed, leaving only darkness inside. Sunny didn't mind. In fact, this was one of the features of his secret lair that he enjoyed the most. Darkness was his best friend. Yawning, he stood up and rubbed his face to chase away the last remnants of sleep. His long, dirty hair was getting in the way, so he moved it back. Let's make some breakfast. But first things first. Sunny moved his hand, pulling on the invisible string that connected his wrist to the ring-shaped pommel of the kunai. The throwing dagger jumped into the air and landed on his palm. This was a trick that had taken Sunny quite some time to master. In the beginning, he almost lost a couple of fingers while trying to learn how to control the flying blade. Walking over to a wall empty of engravings, he used the kunai to scratch a small line into the stone. All around it, there were dozens and dozens of similar lines, grouped neatly into sets of 5. It had already been 4 months since Sunny came to this loathsome, godforsaken city. Many things had happened during that time. Cassie's vision turned out to be true. Far in the west, they indeed found a vast, ruined city surrounded by tall walls, with monsters wandering its narrow streets. And in the center of the city, there was a hill with a magnificent castle standing on its top. Miraculously, the castle was full of people. However, they weren't awakened, as the three of them had hoped. Instead, they were, each and every one of them, mere sleepers. Because there were no gateway in the castle. Hundreds of humans, those who had managed to survive the lethal hellscape of the Forgotten Shore due to their strength or luck, were stuck there with no hope of ever returning to the real world. It was nothing but a graveyard of hope. Remembering his first days in the castle, Sonny couldn't help but laugh out loud. Oh, what a fool he had been! So full of hope and newfound faith in humanity. Where's that faith now, huh? Laughing hysterically, he bent over and slapped his knees. Oh, that's funny! Good one, Sonny. What do you think about that, buddy? The shadow didn't respond, staring at him with reproach. Its silence only made Sonny laugh louder. He just couldn't stop. To be honest, he had gone a little bit insane some time ago. Probably around his third week of living alone in the city. He was more or less alright after leaving the castle due to that unfortunate falling out with, well, it didn't matter. The point was that on his third week, that damn bastard of a knight had almost disemboweled him, leaving Sonny no choice but to crawl away while using his own 2 hands to stop his intestines from falling out. After finding his way to a secluded ditch and lying there for a few days, too weak to move and simply waiting to die, with not a soul around to help him, Sonny wasn't quite the same. Good times. Anyway, he survived. Dismissing the canaille, Sonny walked over to a table that he had scavenged from the ruins of a library and glanced at the gray rock that was lying in its center. No matter how you looked at it, it was just an ordinary rock. However, as soon as Sonny's gaze fell on it, the rock spoke. Wake up, Sunless! Your nightmare is over! That rock was, in fact, one of his most valuable memories. In all ways except for one, it was indeed just a rock, which was already useful enough. There were a lot of things that someone as devious as Sonny could accomplish with the help of a rock. However, this particular rock was also capable of parroting different sounds, which made it simply priceless. Right now, it was parroting Sonny's own voice. Wake up! You vile thing! Struggling with the irrational desire to turn the parrot rock into dust, Sonny dismissed it and removed a piece of cloth from the table. Beneath it, a few strips of monster meat lay on a silver platter. He had hunted this monster himself, which was not an easy task in these parts. In fact, as far as Sonny knew, he was one of the very few people capable of hunting in the city alone. The reason for this was that most of the nightmare creatures populating it were of the fallen rank, with only a handful of weaker ones hiding here and there. No one was crazy enough to hunt the fallen monsters. Instead, large hunting parties used experienced guides to avoid these powerful creatures while searching for easier prey. But to Sonny, singling out stray awakened monsters were comparatively easy. He hunted at night, using deep shadows to make himself nothing short of invisible. If he didn't want to fight a fallen abomination, he didn't have to. Most of the time. In any case, he never went hungry. Sonny grinned and said in a deeply satisfied tone, Ah, life is good. Chapter 97. Life, indeed, was good. In fact, Sonny would even go so far as to say that, currently, it was wonderful. One would expect that being stuck in a cursed city located in the middle of an actual hell, surrounded by nothing but ruins and horrifying monsters, was not really the best way to live your life. But to him, this was somewhat of a paradise. To his surprise, Sonny had found out that this type of existence suited him pretty well. He had no obligations, no need to worry about the future, and, most importantly, was not required to interact with other humans. Humans always made things hard and complicated. He was sick of them. Being on your own was much better. He didn't have to pretend to be someone else, force himself to behave differently from how he wanted to, and strain his mind trying to understand people's convoluted feelings. For the first time in his life, Sonny could simply be himself. Turns out, his true self was very easy to please. He had no shortage of interesting things to do, explore, and kill. His life was very entertaining and comfortable, all things considered. It was at least way better than his pathetic existence in the outskirts, back in the real world. The key to this harmonious feeling was very simple. It was to have no hope. Sonny discovered that hope was the true enemy of peace. It was the most vile and poisonous thing in the universe. If there was even a glimmer of hope to return home, he would have been desperate, full of anxiety, and probably in the middle of some insane disaster right now. Like he had always been before. But without hope, things were simple and pleasant. He really couldn't wish for more. Keep telling yourself this crap. You might really believe it. Sonny grinned. What is there to believe? It's the truth. The shadow silently shook its head, long accustomed to his crazy tirades. Lately, Sonny had been talking with himself a lot, having long arguments that sometimes descended into screaming matches. It was a good way to pass the time. A bit later, he emerged from his secret chamber. Sonny's lair was situated in the upper part of a ruined cathedral, the entrance hidden behind a tall statue of some unknown goddess. There was a small balcony that allowed him to observe the grand hall of the temple over the goddess's shoulder, concealed from sight by the strands of her stone hair. The balcony was really high above the floor, making it impossible for any creature to climb on it by accident. Falling down would certainly kill a normal human. Sonny had discovered the hidden room while spying on the bastard that had gutted him. He had entered the cathedral through the hole in its roof and landed on one of the wide support beams, then walked across and accidentally noticed the small balcony. That's how he and the bastard had become neighbors. The bastard was, in fact, the guardian of this place. He patrolled the grand hall, killing anyone who dared to come inside. Sonny saw plenty of powerful nightmare creatures fall to his sword, cleaved apart without much effort. Of course, the bastard was a nightmare creature of considerable power himself. Sonny was pretty sure that he was at least a devil. Sharing the cathedral with a devil was very convenient. Sonny could sleep easy knowing that no monster would be able to reach the inner sanctum alive. Of course, he had to be careful to never be seen by his murderous roommate. On the upside, he could observe the devil as much as he wanted, waiting for a chance to exact his revenge. Sonny was hellbent on killing the damn knight, eventually. The bastard had to die. But before that, Sonny had to become stronger. Much, much stronger. Walking across the beams of the cathedral, he approached the hole in the roof and climbed through it. Outside, the night was already reigning over the world. It was time to hunt. A skeletal, hunched figure was slowly walking along the narrow street of the cursed city. The creature had long arms that ended with vicious claws and a deformed head with a wide mouth full of razor-sharp fangs. Even with its back bent, the monster was at least 2 meters tall. It was dressed in a torn shroud that was once white, but had long ago turned brown from the dried blood. This was Sonny's prey. The creature, which was called a blood fiend, was among the weakest dwellers of the cursed city. It was merely an awakened monster, barely intelligent and comparatively easy to kill. Of course, nothing was really easy to kill here. After all, each and every human on the forgotten shore was just a dormant beast. Despite the fact that they shared the same rank and class, blood fiends were less formidable than carapace centurions in terms of strength and speed. However, that was only until they smelled blood, which sent them into a murderous frenzy. In that state, these fiends were a true menace. Pathetic, Sonny thought, stalking the nightmare creature from the shadows. He had killed a few of these monsters in the past, and had a great time each time, well, except for this one encounter where he had accidentally scratched himself on a sharp stone. That was not fun at all. Time to die, you ugly freak. The blood fiend was just about to turn the corner when a sudden sound attracted his attention. With unnatural speed, the monster turned around and fell on all fours, his sensitive ears picking up the slightest rustle. Then, he took a few careful steps forward and stopped at a certain spot. In front of the fiend, an ordinary-looking rock was lying on the ground. A second later, the rock suddenly spoke. "Behind you," it said politely. The creature froze for a moment, then turned around with lightning-fast speed. Something whistled in the air, and the upper part of the blood fiend's body separated from the lower. Still refusing to die, the monster reached out with its long arms. Too slow! Sunny slashed with the midnight shard, severing one of the arms at the elbow. Continuing the motion, he took a quick step forward and performed another strike, this time piercing the creature's skull. The tip of the tachi entered through one of its eyes and exited through the back of the head. All of it took less than a second. By the time both parts of the monster fell to the ground, Sunny had already retrieved his sword. Looking up with expectation, he smiled and waited. "Come on, say it!" As if answering his call, the spell whispered. "You have slain an awakened monster, blood fiend. Your shadow grows stronger." Sunny grinned. "Ah, thank you kindly. You're so sweet." The runes shimmered as they appeared in the air in front of him. Looking down, he read, "Shadow fragments, 398/1000. Just 2 fragments away from 400. These days, he was progressing at a very respectable speed. In the beginning, back when he had not known the city and the creatures that populated it, Sunny was lucky to get a few fragments in a week. He had also been much more prone to ending up bloodied and one step away from death. But now, things were slowly changing. He couldn't even remember the last time he felt compelled to say goodbye to life. "Ah, you idiot. You just had to go and think that out loud, huh?" Just as he finished that thought, a distant sound of footsteps reached his ears. Chapter 98. Sunny looked grimly at the corpse of the blood fiend, then in the direction of the approaching footsteps. Who was crazy enough to remain in this cursed city during the night? Only a complete lunatic would do something that stupid. All the sane people were long gone from the streets, not to mention that very few were willing to enter the ruins to begin with. A dark shadow flowed from the tip of the midnight shard's blade. Coalescing on the ground, it stared at him with sarcasm. Sunny stared back. "What?" The shadow shook its head and didn't answer, forcing him to turn away with a confused shrug. "Whatever. It seems we have guests. What to do, what to do? The place is a mess." Looking around, Sunny sighed, glanced at the corpse of the monster once again, and summoned the kunai. The smart thing to do was to run away. Who knew what exactly was producing those footsteps? Maybe it was a group of people, maybe it was a nightmare creature with a lot of feet. It was better not to find out. He wasn't done with the hunt yet. He still had to get his trophies. "Go take a look." Sending the shadow away, Sunny kneeled and began to cut the tough flesh of the dead creature. Without the enhancing effect of the shadow, slicing the blood fiend apart was not as easy. However, he still managed to find the first soul shard rather quickly. One more to go. Meanwhile, the shadow had discovered the uninvited visitors. 6 humans were cautiously walking along the narrow path in the stone ruins, lighting their way with a ghostly blue lantern. They were all rugged men, wearing mismatched suits of armor and armed to the teeth. Their eyes were cold and hard. Sunny raised his eyebrows. "My oh my! They really are people. What is a bunch of Gunlog's thugs doing outside the castle walls in the middle of the night?" Gunlog was the owner of the castle and the self-proclaimed king of this odious place. Every sleeper on the Forgotten Shore was forced to either serve him or pay him tribute. Even still, the latter usually didn't live long. Dismissing the Midnight Shard and the Parrot Rock, Sunny concentrated on searching for the second soul shard. He wanted to be gone from the street before these gentlemen arrived. But the circle of blue light was approaching too fast. Finally catching a glimpse of the glowing crystal, Sunny grabbed it and hurriedly hid it in his armor. Then he dropped the kunai on the ground and took several steps back. But it was too late. They had already seen him. "Be careful! There's a monster!" As Sunny was backing away, several weapons were aimed in his direction. Feeling that things were about to get out of control, he cleared his throat and said in a trembling voice, "Oh! Please don't hurt me. I'm a human." Saying this, he mentally looked himself over. With his ghostly pale skin and dirty hair, his ragged armor covered in layers of dried and fresh blood, Sunny was indeed easy to mistake for a nightmare creature. He wasn't really paying much attention to personal hygiene and appearances these days. Hopefully, speaking in a human language would prove his identity. Raising his hands to show that he wasn't armed, Sonny took another step back. The 6 sleepers were really surprised to see another human this far away from the walls of the castle, especially at night. Using their momentary confusion, he cautiously moved even further away. "Don't move!" Finally able to comprehend the situation, one of the castle inhabitants hissed a threatening command. Sonny obediently froze, careful not to make any sudden movements. The unexpected guests proceeded to come closer, glancing at the corpse of the blood fiend as they walked past it. One of them was taller and better equipped than the rest. Piercing Sonny with a menacing gaze, he approached him and stopped 1 or 2 steps away. The man was older than Sonny by a few years. He was tall and muscular, with a patchy beard covering the lower part of his face and a mean look in his watery blue eyes. From his demeanor and memories, it was easy to tell that the leader of the group had spent no less than 3 years on the forgotten shore. He had experience and time to grow stronger than most sleepers here. However, it was also apparent that he wasn't really high up in the ranks of Gunlog's army. Otherwise, his equipment would have been much more impressive. Still, the heavy battle axe that was resting on the man's shoulder looked really sharp. It would take him only a second to bring that thing down on Sonny's head. "Who are you? What the hell are you doing here?" Sonny blinked a couple of times, then gulped and answered carefully. I'm Sunless. I live here." The leader of the hunting party, if that what it was, narrowed his eyes. "What, live here? Do you take me a fool, boy? No one can survive in the city." The other sleepers were of the same opinion, except for one, who looked at Sonny with doubt. Frowning, he took a step forward and said in an uncertain tone, "Wait, Chief. He might be telling truth. I heard that there's a crazy kid who lives in the ruins alone." The taller man scowled. "How is that possible?" His subordinate glanced at Sonny and shrugged. "From what I heard, his aspect allows the boy to hide in the shadows really well. I guess he crawls around like a rat and picks up the leftovers after the monsters are done eating. I don't really know, but someone was talking about him back in the castle. I thought they were just telling tales." Sonny frowned. Crazy boy rat, why did everyone feel compelled to call him names? Meanwhile, the helpful sleeper thought for a bit and added, "I think he came into town with that bitch, Changing Star." Sonny's frown turned into a scowl. Looking down, he whispered to his shadow, "These guys are really very rude, don't you think?" Of course, his whisper was easily heard by everyone around. The sleepers stared at him in confusion. Sonny tilted his head a little and opened his eyes wide, as if shocked by something. "What? You think I should kill them all? I mean, isn't it a little bit over the top? I should give them a chance to apologize, at least." The leader of the hunting party took a step forward and said in a low, growling voice, "What are you mumbling about, rat?" Sonny looked at him with scorn and dissatisfaction. "Hey, I was talking to my buddy. Can you please not interrupt?" A wide, dangerous smile appeared on the tall man's face. With a sigh, Sonny turned to him and said, "All right, if you insist. You guys have offended my dearest friend, Nephi's of the Immortal Flame clan. She and I are very, very close. So I'll give you one chance to apologize for calling her a, well, you know. If you don't, say goodbye to your lives." The older man stared at him for several seconds, then suddenly raised his head and laughed. "Oh, that's a good one. Have you heard, guys? This tiny weasel will give us a chance. How generous! Should we be generous too, huh? What do you say? The boy is sick in the head, after all." The other 5 sleepers were not sharing his enthusiasm. One of them smiled darkly and said, "No, Chief. I think we should just kill him. Put the poor fool out of his misery, you know." The sleeper that had collaborated Sonny's story before, meanwhile, was frowning again. "Wait, guys, he's one of Changing Star's people, remember? The original group, I mean. They had survived 2 entire months in the labyrinth on their own. We shouldn't underestimate TH." However, the leader interrupted him with a contemptuous scoff. "I heard that St. Nephi's carried 2 useless sacks of shit on her back all the way to the castle. The bitch is fond of taking care of weaklings, right? That delicious little friend of hers is blind, for God's sake. I'm sure that this one is no better. Then, he turned to Sunny and grinned. I tell you what, Rat. Give us all your memories, and we'll be generous enough to let you live. If an awakened died, their memories disappeared with them. The only way to get the memories was to make the owner transfer them of their own free will. However, whether or not that will was affected by coercion or torture didn't really matter. At least not to people like these. Sunny blinked. So you're not going to apologize? The tall man grinned. I think not. Sunny sighed. Oh well. So you want my memories, eh? I have a few. Let me think, how about this one? Lowering one hand, he summoned the parrot rock. It immediately appeared on his palm, looking as boring and ordinary as always. The leader of the hunting party frowned, not taking his eyes away from Sunny's face. Despite his crude exterior, he was paranoid and careful. Years of experience had taught him to never lower his guard. A moment later the rock spoke. Behind you! That was the most basic of tricks. The tall man grinned, still looking Sunny in the eyes. Do you really think that I would fall for? However, before he was done talking, the blade of the kunai hit him from behind, penetrating the back of the man's skull and killing him on the spot. Chapter 99. Sunny had dropped the throwing dagger near the monster's body in advance, and then took all those steps back to make this exact situation possible. As soon as the parrot rock spoke, he pulled on the invisible string, sending the kunai flying back in his direction. The tall bastard didn't just happen to be in its path, either. You have slain. The leader of the hunting party really should have listened to that rock. Shadow grows stronger. Before the sleepers even had time to react, Sunny was already moving. The shadow had been wrapped around his body a long time ago, making him that much faster. Summoning the midnight shard, he fluidly slashed at the nearest enemy, severing the man's arm at the elbow. The blade struck right between the vambrace and the coutre of his enchanted plate armor. To Sunny, these people were slow and clumsy, their power level and technique severely lacking. He had already been more experienced than them after the harrowing journey through the Crimson Labyrinth, learning how to wield the sword in combat from Changing Star herself. The 3 months he had spent hunting and surviving alone in the Cursed City only made the gap that much wider. Despite looking like easy prey, Sunny was anything but. However, he wasn't foolish enough to challenge all 5 of them. People might have been weaker than nightmare creatures, but what made them really dangerous was their unpredictability. Each aspect was unique, arming humans with a formidable arsenal of inexplicable abilities. Facing something you couldn't understand was the surest way to end up dead. With his advantage of surprise gone, Sunny decided that it was time to retreat. Turning around, he jumped out of the circle of light and ran. It was really hard to pursue someone who could see in the dark on these narrow streets, so there was a real chance of escaping unscathed. However, the kunai was still attached to Sunny's wrist. Sliding out of the dead leader's skull, it fell to the ground and clinked loudly against the stones, then jumped a few meters away and hit the pavement again, creating more noise. Get the bastard! He killed the chief! Following the sound of metal striking against stone, the sleepers lunged forward, following in Sunny's footsteps. What a persistent bunch! Even the guy who had lost his arm was on his heels, either having a way to stop the bleeding or simply unwilling to let the attacker escape even if it cost him his own life. This part of the city was Sunny's hunting ground. He knew every nook and cranny of these streets like his own 5 fingers. Honestly, he was unsure what these guys were even thinking. If it wasn't for him carefully choosing the path, they would have ended up disturbing some terrifying fallen creature and becoming its dinner a long time ago. Something wasn't quite right here. Gunlog's people might have been thugs, but they were experienced and accomplished hunters. They feared the city and knew how to behave while outside the castle walls. Otherwise, all of them would have been dead a long time ago. Come to think of that, it was extremely rare to see them going anywhere near the city at night. Were these fools even real hunters? If not, what were they up to? Sunny briefly considered leaving one of them alive to interrogate later, but then decided against it. To be honest, he wasn't really curious. Human business had long ago lost its allure in his eyes. He had much more interesting things to do. Finally reaching his goal, Sonny lingered on the steps, pretending to be in a panic. The 5 sleepers were once again able to lay eyes on their victim. The scrawny kid was hesitating in front of the entrance to a large ruined building, fear clearly written on his dirty, pale face. It seemed as though he didn't know where to go, afraid to run into a dead end. Noticing them, he flinched and dove into the building with desperation in his eyes. "You have nowhere to run now, rat!" hissed the man who had lost his hand to Sonny's blade. Full of killing intent, the sleepers followed the crazy young man into the building. However, once they got inside, they saw no sign of the scared kid. The only thing they saw was a simple rock lying on the floor. As the one-armed man belatedly realized that something was wrong, the rock said in an ominous tone, "Say goodbye to your lives." A second later, a massive silhouette stepped out of the darkness. The man's eyes widened as the figure of a regal knight clad in a menacing black armor reflected in them. The creature was more than 2 meters tall, his Gothic armor forged from a lusterless, anthracite steel. Every part of the armor was decorated with intricate engravings that told a tale so horrifying that anyone would go insane from looking at them for too long. The helmet of the Black Knight was crowned with curved horns that might have been wings once. In the narrow fissure of his visor, 2 ghastly red flames were burning with indescribable menace. Before the sleeper had time to react, a heavy black blade fell from above, effortlessly severing his body from head to groin, cutting through flesh, bone and armor with similar ease. A torrent of blood surged to the floor. Climbing onto one of the supporting beams of the ruined cathedral, Sonny sat down and looked at the slaughter that was happening below. Huh! The bastard is in a really bad mood today. Well, have fun! Some time later, as the echoes of screams began to fade away, he sighed and counted the corpses lying on the distant floor. It was hard to count, because most of them were in pieces. Making sure that not one of the pursuers got away alive, Sonny frowned and shook his head. 6 people. Their disappearance won't go unnoticed. Especially if they were really up to no good. Why do I feel like I had just gotten myself in trouble? Chapter 100. The Black Knight remained motionless for several minutes, silently observing the corpses of his enemies. Drops of blood fell from the blade of his fearsome great sword, gathering into a puddle beneath his feet. The thoughts of the cruel creature were a mystery. To be honest, Sonny wasn't even sure that this unstoppable mountain of murderous black steel was sentient. In that regard, the monstrous inhabitants of the cursed city were a bit strange. Usually, nightmare creatures of higher classes possessed a perverse form of intelligence, which was often comparable to that of humans, and sometimes even surpassed it. However, that rule did not apply to every monster in this eerie place. From Sonny's observations, the dwellers of the ruined city could be roughly divided into 2 groups. The first group consisted of various creatures that came here from outside the wall, be it from the labyrinth, or from the depths of the dark sea. These abominable things more or less followed the unnatural laws of the spell that every awakened was familiar with. The second group was different. These creatures, he suspected, were either created from the remains of the ancient residents of the city or, creepily, had actually been them once. The wraiths, as he called them, were much more unfathomable and dangerous. Their powers and behavior refused to abide by any sort of sense or logic. The Black Knight was one of these sinister revenants. That's why Sonny had trouble predicting his actions. Most of the time, the regal devil was content simply patrolling the grand hall of the ruined cathedral, and killing anything that dared to come inside. Just like he had killed those poor fools. With a sigh, Sonny lay down on top of the support beam and, not paying any attention to the deadly height of his improvised resting spot, closed his eyes. He wanted to take a breath before continuing with his nightly errands. Soon, the sound of heavy footsteps informed him that the bastard had resumed his never-ending patrol. Good riddance. Despite the fact that nothing was disturbing his peace anymore, Sonny still felt strangely restless. His inner voice was in the mood to chat. Sonny. Aren't you forgetting something? He frowned. What was there to forget? He was just catching his breath before going out again. He also had to wait for the right moment to scavenge through the possessions of these dead hunters. You just killed 6 people. Don't you feel guilty? Sonny was a little startled by this question. Curious, he listened to his emotions and came to the conclusion that no, he did not feel guilty at all. This was his 3rd time killing a human being. Granted, the first time happened inside a nightmare, where people were supposed to be simple illusions. However, Sonny wasn't sure that he believed in this theory. The old slaver's anguish had felt awfully real to be just a figment of his imagination. The second time, well, he didn't want to think about that. That happened in the castle, anyway, and that part of his life was over. The 3rd time was the cleanest of them all. Those thugs were going to rob and kill him, anyway. Sonny had seen through their intentions long before pulling on the invisible string and sending their leader into the cold embrace of death. He could have tried to run away, but they were very rude. If the thugs had insulted just him, Sonny might have tried to end the confrontation without bloodshed. However, they insulted Nephi's. Bastards deserved to die. Despite the fact that his relationship with Changing Star had become strained, he still cared about her a great deal. Leaving the castle did not mean that he had forgotten their friendship. It's just that there were more reasons to leave than to stay. With a sigh, Sonny summoned the beautiful bottle made out of patterned blue glass. This was the farewell gift that Cassie had given him before their parting. He cherished this memory very much. Bringing the bottle to his lips, Sonny took several sips of cold, delicious water and opened his eyes. He didn't want to rest anymore. Better to get moving. Before venturing out again, Sonny returned to his room and walked over to a large iron chest that was standing in one of its corners. Exerting some strength, he lifted the heavy lid and admired his treasure pile. Inside the chest, more than 100 beautiful soul shards were glowing softly in the dark. The sight of them always lifted Sonny's mood. Despite the fact that he himself had no use for the soul shards, they were still a valuable resource. Here on the Forgotten Shore, shards were a form of currency among the sleepers. 100 of them was an unimaginable amount. After a lifetime of being a pauper, Sonny was finally rich. Money, I have so much money! If a person wanted to live inside the castle walls, they had to pay a tribute of 1 soul shard every week. Those who could not afford it were forced to remain outside, living in a makeshift settlement just beyond the gates, which was often attacked by the monsters. Even so, they had to pay for food or go out and hunt themselves, which more often than not led to their deaths. With how much Sonny had gathered in these 3 months, he would have been able to live in the comfort of the castle for years, if he wanted to. Which, of course, he did not. Why would he pay for accommodations when he already had a palace of his own? One with no noisy neighbors and a fearsome guardian protecting the premises, no less. Putting 2 new soul shards in the chest, Sonny glanced at his dragon hoard one last time and closed the lid with a satisfied smile. Perhaps it was time to visit the castle again and buy a few things. No. He had already bought everything he needed the last time. Spending too many shards would make people doubt that he was as pathetic as everyone thought he was. Of all the sleepers in the castle, only 3 people knew that he was not just good at hiding in the shadows and avoiding danger. They were Nephi's Cassie and Castor. That damn bastard.